According to the Americans, none of the victims recovered in Ekaterinburg could possibly be 17 years old, the age at which Anastasia disappeared.
One tiny genetic fluke nearly derailed the biggest forensic investigation in history, and that is not even the wildest part of the story.
The Americans believe it is Anastasia, not Marie, who remains missing.
For decades, the world wondered if the Romanov children had escaped into the night, but new data shows that the cover-up was so deep, even the scientists were confused for a while.
The Romanov family were the last in the line of a 300-year-old dynasty that ruled Russia.
See, the truth was hidden 70 yards away from the main grave in a shallow pit that held the final pieces of the puzzle. What most people do not realize is that the science used to solve this case changed forensics forever, proving that no secret stays buried when DNA is on the case. Imperial dynasty vanishes overnight. 300 years of power did not just fade away, it was wiped out in a matter of minutes inside a cramped basement in Siberia. For starters, the Romanov dynasty was once the absolute heart of the massive Russian Empire, ruling over millions with a level of wealth that is hard to even imagine. But by the early 20th century, that heart was failing fast. The pressures of a disastrous world war, widespread famine, and a rising revolutionary fever had shattered the foundations of imperial rule. In March of 1917, Tsar Nicholas II, a leader who was totally ill-prepared for the tidal wave of history, gave up his throne. Just like that, 3 centuries of Romanov power vanished into thin air. The Tsar, his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their only son, the young and frail Alexei, became prisoners of the state. Hands down, they were some of the most famous people in the world, but suddenly they were stripped of their titles and their freedom. They were moved far from the capital to a town in Siberia, and finally to the industrial city of Yekaterinburg. There, they were confined to a merchant's house, a place the Bolsheviks renamed the House of Special Purpose. The windows were painted over, and their gilded cage grew smaller with each passing day. It was a stressful time for the family, who were used to palaces and servants, but now they were guarded by men who despised everything they stood for. In the pre-dawn hours of July 17, 1918, the family and 4 of their loyal staff were woken from their sleep. They were told the advancing anti-Bolshevik army was near and they needed to move to the basement for their own safety. Down the stairs they went, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, their doctor, a maid, a cook, and a valet. The room was small and bare, with nothing but the cold stone floor beneath their feet. As they stood waiting, a group of armed men filed into the room. Their leader, Yakov Yurovsky, read a short statement saying the local government had sentenced them to their end. What followed was not a clean or swift act, but a scene of pure chaos. The room erupted in a frenzy of gunfire that lasted much longer than anyone expected. The most shocking fact is that due to jewels sewn into the daughter's underclothing, many of the initial shots failed to be effective, ricocheting around the small space. The scene became even more frantic as the men resorted to using their weapons in a much more physical and disturbing way to finish their grim work. When the smoke finally faded, 11 people lay on the floor. An entire dynasty had been ended in a matter of minutes. But for the men who carried out the act, the night's gruesome task was only half finished. The world could never know what happened here. The Romanovs had to disappear completely so they wouldn't become symbols for their supporters. Their bodies were loaded onto a truck and driven into the forest under the cover of darkness. The initial plan was to throw them down a 20-foot deep abandoned mine shaft called the Four Brothers. They stripped the bodies and doused them with sulfuric acid to make them unrecognizable. To put it mildly, the plan failed. The mine shaft was too shallow, and the bodies were still visible from the top. Panic set in among the soldiers. In a desperate scramble, they pulled the bodies back out of the pit and loaded them back onto the truck. Time was running out as the sun began to rise. They found a new spot, a muddy track called Koptyaki Road. There, in a shallow pit, they hastily buried 9 of the 11 victims. For 73 years, their secret lay hidden beneath the Siberian soil, forgotten by many but whispered about by some. In 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian investigators acting on a secret report from the 70s finally opened the grave. Inside, they found a tangled mass of 9 skeletons. The world held its breath, but the discovery only deepened the mystery. There were 9 bodies, but there should have been 11. 2 of the Tsar's children were missing, and people began to wonder if a miracle had actually happened. The missing children left a gap in the story that many people were eager to fill with hope.
Missing heirs fuel global legend. The discovery of the grave without 2 of the children sent shockwaves around the globe. For decades, legends had swirled about survivors who had escaped that basement. The most famous was a woman named Anna Anderson, who claimed for over 60 years that she was the Grand Duchess Anastasia, saved from the basement by a compassionate soldier. With 2 bodies missing from the grave, her story and the stories of countless other imposters suddenly seemed plausible. Had Alexei, the heir, and one of his sisters, Maria or Anastasia, truly escaped into the night? The mystery, it seemed, was far from over. This is where a new kind of investigation began, one that would take place not in the forests of Siberia, but in the sterile and quiet world of a laboratory. You see, the 1990s was the dawn of a new age for DNA forensics. For the first time, scientists believed they could definitively answer a question that had haunted history for decades. The lead scientist on the project was Dr. Peter Gill in the United Kingdom. His team faced a monumental task, extracting usable DNA from bones that were nearly 80 years old and had been damaged by acid. They focused on something called mitochondrial DNA. Unlike regular DNA, which comes from both parents, mitochondrial DNA is passed down almost unchanged from a mother to her children. This makes it perfect for tracing family lines through the women. To prove the remains belonged to the Serena and her daughters, they needed a sample from a living relative on the mother's side. The search led them to an unbelievable source in Buckingham Palace. Prince Philip, the husband to Queen Elizabeth II, was the grandnephew of Tsarina Alexandra. His grandmother and Alexandra were sisters. When approached by the scientists, he agreed to provide a blood sample. It was an extraordinary moment connecting 2 of the world's most famous royal families in the name of science. When the lab compared Prince Philip's DNA to the samples from the grave, the results were stunning. The DNA from the skeleton believed to be Alexandra and those of 3 of the young women were a perfect match. Science had just proven that the Tsarina and 3 of her daughters lay in that shallow grave. But then came another twist. What many overlooked was a strange quirk found in the Tsar's DNA. To identify Nicholas, scientists compared his DNA to that of living relatives from his father's line. While it was a close match, there was a tiny and baffling anomaly. The Tsar's sample showed a rare condition called heteroplasmy, where a person has more than one type of mitochondrial DNA sequence in their cells. It was a 1 in 1,000 genetic fluke. This tiny detail was enough to cast a shadow of doubt over the entire investigation. Russian authorities and some scientists were skeptical. Could this really be the Tsar, or was it someone else entirely? The debate raged on, providing just enough uncertainty to keep the conspiracy theories alive for another few years. Meanwhile, science also closed the book on Anna Anderson. A tissue sample of hers, saved from a medical procedure years earlier, was tested. Her DNA proved she was actually a Polish factory worker, not a Russian princess. Science had closed one door, but the mystery of the 2 missing children was still wide open, and the world was still looking for them. Even with the fake princesses debunked, the absence of 2 bodies meant the story was not over. Royal blood secrets revealed by science. For another 16 years, the case remained frozen in time. The world knew the fate of 9 of the victims, but the 2 missing children continued to fuel speculation. Their absence was a blank page in the history books, allowing the fairy tales of escape and survival to endure. The Russian Orthodox Church even refused to officially recognize the remains without the 2 missing children being accounted for. History, it seemed, was determined to hold on to its greatest mystery until every single piece of evidence was found. Then, in the summer of 2007, a small group of amateur enthusiasts armed with metal detectors and a deep obsession with the Romanov story decided to search the area around the main grave one last time. They were guided by the writings of Yakov Yurovsky, the man who led the squad that night. In his secret account of the event, he mentioned trying to burn the bodies of two of the victims in a separate location to confuse anyone who might find the grave. Following this grim map, the searchers focused on a clearing just 70 yards away from the first grave. What they found was horrifying. It was not a grave in the traditional sense, but a small and shallow pit barely 2 feet deep. Inside were 44 small charred bone fragments and several teeth. The thing nobody tells you is the truly grim nature of this discovery. This was not just a burial, it was a desperate and vicious attempt to completely annihilate two bodies. The bones had been hacked apart, burned at an extremely high temperature, and then doused with sulfuric acid again. The men involved had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure these two would never be found or identified. The bone fragments were rushed to forensic experts for testing. Anthropologists determined the remains belonged to two young people, a boy between 12 and 15 years old and a young woman between 15 and 19. The ages were a perfect match for 13-year-old Alexei and either 17-year-old Maria or 18-year-old Anastasia. It was a heart-stopping moment for the researchers. After 90 years, the last pieces of the puzzle might have finally been found. This time, there would be no room for doubt or legends. The bone fragments were sent to the world's top DNA labs, including the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory in the United States and a facility in Austria. This ensured the results would be cross-verified by independent teams. The DNA was badly damaged, far more so than the first set of remains because of the fire and the acid. But technology had advanced light years since the 90s. Scientists were now able to extract both mitochondrial and nuclear DNA from the tiny fragments, giving them a much clearer picture of who these children were. When the results came back, the mystery was finally solved for good. Charred remains solve ancient mystery. The results from the labs were absolute and unanimous. The mitochondrial DNA proved the remains belonged to a child of Serena Alexandra. The nuclear DNA proved they were the children of both Alexandra and Tsar Nicholas. And specialized Y chromosome testing confirmed the boy was a male relative of the Tsar. The statistical probability that these were not the missing Romanov children was, for all practical purposes, 0. The science was undeniable, and every Romanov was finally accounted for. But what did this truly mean for the stories we had been told? The definitive DNA results did not just solve a mystery, they destroyed a myth. And the reality left in its place was far darker than even the most pessimistic historians had imagined. For generations, the world clung to the possibility of an escape. The story of Anastasia in particular became a modern fairy tale, a symbol of hope and survival against impossible odds. Many people are crazy about these kinds of stories where a single person makes it out alive. It was a romantic idea, a way to find a sliver of light in an otherwise pitch-black chapter of history. But the DNA evidence was a brutal awakening. There was no escape. There was no survivor. Every single member of the family met their end in Yekaterinburg. What the science revealed was the full, unvarnished horror of their final hours. This was not just a political act, it was a frantic, panicked, and savage attempt to erase a family from existence. The most shocking fact is what happened to the last two children. The men separated the bodies of Alexei and one of his sisters, taking them to a separate location, not just to bury them, but to subject them to a final, horrific act of desecration. They were burned and shattered in a desperate effort to make sure no trace of the heir and his sister would ever be found. This is the dark truth that the DNA laid bare. The legend of a surviving princess was a comforting story the world told itself to avoid confronting the unbearable reality that an entire family, including 5 children, was not only dispatched, but systematically and brutally obliterated. The hope for a happy ending was crushed by the grim weight of forensic science. It is a tough pill to swallow, but history is often more about the harsh truth than the legends we prefer. The final results show that no one survived that night, but do you think the legend of Anastasia will ever truly disappear from our culture? Let us know your thoughts below, like and subscribe for more.